One of the many things we enjoy about road trips is visiting with people. Sometimes that's the purpose of the trip. We drive across the state or across the country to visit some friends or family members. Sometimes visiting people is what we do on our way to somewhere else. We make a detour to drop in on an old friend or a second cousin twice removed. When I was a kid growing up, every few summers we drove from New York to Miami to visit with one of my grandmothers. 3 days and 2 nights in the station wagon. No air conditioning, no seat belts. The only entertainment system we had was car bingo and beating up on your brother. One summer we drove from New York to Dallas to visit some old college friends of my parents. The next summer we drove to Minneapolis for the same reason. And throughout the year we would drive all over the tri-state area to visit with our family members over the holidays. And chances are you did the same thing and you still do the same thing because people matter to us. And so we make trips, we go on the road, we go out of our way to spend time with them, to let them know they matter to us, to have our lives continually enriched by our relationship with them. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that as Jesus made his trip from Galilee to Jerusalem, he stopped to visit with people along the way. Sometimes it was just a conversation by the side of the road. Sometimes he sat down and had dinner with people. Now we're learning a lot about Jesus as we join him on his journey to Jerusalem and the cross. We're working our way through the travel narrative, Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapters 9 through 19. We've learned some things about leaving things behind in order to follow Jesus on the road. We've learned how to pray with Jesus as we go down the road. Today we're going to learn something about the people that we meet on the road, how we treat people, especially people who are not like us. As I think about those people that my family and I visited on our many, many road trips, for the most part, they were people like us. They were white people, middle-class people, all of them Christians in one sense of that word or another, all of them having an affinity for pizza and bagels and certain sports teams. People mostly like us. And chances are that's been true of you on your trips, whether in the past or now. People you visit with. Think about the folks you visit with on your many trips. Think about the people you've spent time with over the past 6 months. Not just on the road, but as you make your way through the week, work, school, your social calendar. Chances are that culturally, demographically, most of those people are like you. And there's nothing especially wrong with that. It's natural to be drawn to people who are like us. It's easy, it's comfortable. But is it good? Is it redemptive? Is it Christ-like? What would our social calendars look like if Jesus were planning them? What would our church fellowship look like if we valued people the way Jesus valued people? What might we be missing by limiting ourselves to people who are like us? These are some of the questions we're going to be asking as we join Jesus on the road to Jerusalem. Today we're going to be in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, the first 14 verses, and we find a collection of 3 little scenarios in this little passage, and we'll take them one at a time. We'll begin, Luke 14, verse 1. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of the body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and he stops to observe the Sabbath and to worship at a local synagogue. And after services, it seems, he is invited to brunch at the home of a local Pharisee. Now, Luke calls our attention to the fact that he's a prominent Pharisee. That could mean he's wealthy. That could mean he has a certain rank in the synagogue. It means he's highly regarded in the community. Chances are the other guests around the table invited to that dinner were equally prominent people. All except for one. There was also a sick man there. Luke, the physician, describes his condition as abnormal swelling of the body, sometimes called dropsy. It was an uncomfortable and an unattractive condition. And it probably made the guests uncomfortable to be in close proximity to someone with such an unattractive condition. What made it worse was that in the eyes of many people, including the Pharisees, this man's condition was probably his own fault. He must have done something wrong for God to have afflicted him in this way. Now, before we're too hard on the Pharisees for thinking that way, perhaps we should ask if sometimes we're prone to that kind of thinking as well. We're sometimes prone to think that when people have problems or find themselves in a difficult situation, it must be their fault. If only they worked harder, they might be better off financially. If only he or she dressed more fashionably, they might be more popular. If they took better care of themselves, they might not have so many health problems. Now, we do that. We think that way, in part to distance ourselves from them and from their condition, and perhaps to convince ourselves that we have somehow earned our prosperity or our popularity or our good health, because that allows us to feel better about the place we occupy in life and to be a little more comfortable with their lot in life. And so in this first scenario, Luke and Jesus cast a spotlight on these two people at opposite ends of the social and spiritual ladder. The prominent Pharisee at the top and the uncomfortably afflicted man at the bottom. Now, it's pretty safe to say these two people wouldn't normally be seated together at dinner around a table. But Jesus has brought them together and has thrown the spotlight on them as if he has a point he wants to make. Now, it could be the point that the Sabbath was made for healing, for restoration, and for helping people, and for wellness. And Jesus is going to go ahead and heal this man. The thing is, Jesus has made that point many, many times before, and much more dramatically than this. In this case, Jesus seems to be making yet another point. Because listen to what he says at the end of this little scene. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. What he's pointing out is that this man didn't matter enough to them. If he did, if they truly valued him as a human being, then they wouldn't hesitate to help him or to rejoice at his healing like they would for one of their own children or even one of their own animals. But because he's not one of them, because of his unfortunate condition, because of his place in society, this man doesn't matter as much to them. So it turns out this isn't primarily a story about what's lawful on the Sabbath. It's a story about who matters on the Sabbath. And Jesus' answer is everyone. Everyone matters on the Sabbath. And in particular, those who are least likely to matter. Those who are different from us. Those we might not be comfortable with. Those who might be on some different place on whatever scale we use to measure people's importance to us. Jesus isn't just challenging their legalism. He's exposing their prejudice, their failure to recognize the equal worth and dignity of every human being. Now, it turns out that's a pretty relevant point to be making today in our time. It's a point that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to make. Now, I realize it's a very politically charged phrase to bring up on a Sunday morning. And by bringing it up, I'm not endorsing everything about that particular movement. I'm simply calling attention to the fundamental point they're trying to make. That in our society, it seems that some lives don't matter as much as other lives. In almost every aspect of our society, black lives seem to matter less than some other lives. People with black and brown skin are far more likely to be in prison, far more likely to attend a substandard school, far more likely to live below the poverty line, far less likely to own a home, far less likely to be in senior leadership of any organization or institution, far less likely to get quality health care. And as we've discovered, even in the most liberalized industry in our country, far less likely to be nominated for an Academy Award. And before we respond by saying, yeah, but, we need to ask ourselves the question Jesus asked his guests that day. If it was our family members who were consistently experiencing these kinds of hardships, wouldn't we want to talk about it? Wouldn't we want something to be done about it? And before we say, yeah, but other people have had it hard too, let's remember that there was a time when our Constitution declared that African slaves counted 3/5 as much as white citizens when it came to representation in Congress. And if we're feeling a little uncomfortable right now, and we're feeling very much like the people who are gathered around that dinner table on that Sabbath afternoon, and what they didn't realize is that it was going to get even more uncomfortable. So let's keep going. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, did you notice that in the first scene, the Pharisees were watching Jesus? And in this scene, Jesus is watching them. And what he's watching is how they choose their seats. Have you ever wondered how Jesus always knew just the right thing to say or do? He always knew the right person to talk to. He always knew exactly the right question to ask. Now, to be sure, in part, it was the prompting of the Spirit, but it was also because the fact that Jesus was always watching. He was always watching people and what was happening in the room. And you can learn a lot by watching what's happening. Have you ever watched people congregate in the lobby after one of our services on any of our campuses? If you watch, you'll notice a couple things. One of the first things you'll probably notice is the diversity of the congregation. All kinds of age and ethnicities and backgrounds, and it's a wonderful thing. The second thing you're likely to notice is that people tend to be congregating with people who are like them in age or ethnicity or background. And you'll also probably notice that there are one or two or three people scattered about who are standing by themselves, not really relating to anybody. I wonder what Jesus might say if he were to watch that scene. What he's watching here in this scene is the way people choose their seats around the table. These prominent Pharisees, and what he recognizes is that they are jockeying for position around the table. Now, the table in those days was probably a U-shaped table with the host seated at the head of the table at the top of the U, the next honored guest to his right and his left, and then in descending order away from the host. And so these Pharisees are trying to get the best position. And occupying a seat of honor meant that you were a very important person. Maybe by virtue of your status in the community, maybe by virtue of your relationship with the host, maybe both. And so these Pharisees are literally elbowing each other to try to get to the better place. And they're judging each other based on whatever set of culturally determined criteria were relevant. Maybe their knowledge of the law, maybe the righteousness of their lives, maybe the length of their tassels, maybe their rank in the synagogue. Who knows? But they're choosing their seats. Jesus warns them that when the host shows up, he may have a very different set of standards by which he evaluates everybody, and he may entirely rearrange the table, which could be a rude awakening for some of the folks around that table. How much better, Jesus says, to choose the lower place right from the get-go. Because then the only place you have to go is up. Now, this word honor brings to mind another politically charged word in our culture these days, so we might as well get it on the table, so to speak. We're hearing a lot these days about the word privilege, and white privilege in particular. Someone has described privilege this way. The privilege is the advantage that one person has over another simply because of the group they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. The advantage one person has over another simply because of the group they belong to. This kind of privilege might be granted to a person on the basis of race or gender or age or physical appearance or class. As one person put it, privilege means some people get to ride the escalator through life while others have to take the stairs, simply because of the way the system works. Now, it doesn't mean that life is always easier for people with privilege. It doesn't mean that life is always easier for white people than it is for people of color. It doesn't mean that every white person has it easier than every black person. Certainly, there are all kinds of variations and exceptions to human experience. It doesn't mean that women or minorities or seniors never enjoy any advantages, like discount movie tickets, for instance. It simply means the culture, the system is wired to favor certain kinds of people. Now, I realize that sometimes people bristle at this notion of privilege, so let me try to illustrate how it works. When I step up to speak on a Sunday morning, I don't have to worry that people might be suspicious of or surprised by my academic credentials, like a speaker with black or brown skin might have to wonder. I don't have to worry that people might be put off by my accent, the way a non-native English speaker might have to worry. I don't have to wonder if someone might get up and walk out in protest while I'm preaching, like a female preacher has to worry. And I can assure you, every woman who preaches here wonders about that, because it's happened many times. I don't have to worry that people might think I'm too young to have anything to say. or too old to be relevant, right? Not yet, anyway. I don't have to get here extra early because I'm not sure how hard it's going to be to get my wheelchair from the parking lot to the pulpit. That's privilege. I don't have to be distracted, discouraged, or demeaned by any of these concerns simply because I'm white, male, typically abled, and in the prime of life. I get the benefit of the doubt. I get a fair hearing. I get to be my true self, and I get to do my best work. That's privilege. Now, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean I intentionally put anyone else down to get that privilege. It doesn't mean I even asked for it. Privilege is simply granted to me by the culture because of certain characteristics over which I have virtually no control. That's privilege. And if we don't see it, then we're not paying attention. And if we won't acknowledge it, we can never fully be the people or the community God would have us to be. I want to say that again. If we don't see it, we're not paying attention. And if we won't acknowledge it, just acknowledge it, we can never be the people or the community God would have us to be. I realize this is a difficult conversation to have. I know some of you are just wishing I would preach another nice sermon on prayer like I did last week. I've been in many conversations about this in the past couple of years, and they're always difficult. It's very difficult for us to hear these things without getting defensive, without saying, yeah, but other people have had it rough too, or yeah, but that was a long time ago, or yeah, but don't blame me. But this is the conversation that the Pharisees needed to have that day around the table. And this is the conversation we need to have if we're going to become the church, the community of faith that God would have us to be. And if we're going to have the redemptive presence in our culture that Christ wants his church to have. And Jesus is asking of us what he asked of them, to intentionally choose the lower place. To lay down our privilege so that others might rise up and have opportunity. To provide opportunities for people that the system, that the church might not typically provide. To intentionally engage and empower people who are not like us and people who might not normally get a chance. Now, in just a minute, I'll offer some practical ways we can do that, but let's quickly get to the third scene of the passage. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." One commentator said he was preaching on this passage one Sunday, and he challenged his parishioners that the next time they had a dinner party, not to invite the people they normally like to hang out with, but to invite the poor and the disabled and the different. That week, he got 3 dinner invitations. So I'm not looking for one, okay? What exactly is Jesus saying here? There's certainly nothing wrong with having friends and family over for dinner. Nothing wrong with that. Jesus is simply saying, when you do that, open your home and your hearts as well to people you might not normally think of. people you might not typically spend time with, people who might not normally get invited to things like that in society, people whose value you or society might have overlooked. And when we do that, Jesus says, we'll be blessed. We'll be rewarded. Our lives and our homes and our church and our community will be enriched in ways we can never possibly imagine in this life and in the life to come. So here's how I'd like to summarize the lesson that we're learning today. On the road with Jesus, we learn that everyone matters, especially those who are least likely to matter. Everyone matters, especially those who are least likely to matter. And so it's true. All lives matter, as many people are reminding us today. All lives matter. Everyone matters to Jesus. They matter so much that when he encounters a community or a culture in which some lives don't matter as much as others, he calls them out. And he asks them to acknowledge it. And he asks them to talk about it. And he asks them to do something about it. And what he asks us to do is to enter into these conversations, to choose the lower place when we have opportunities, and to open our hearts and homes to people who are not like us. Now, what does that mean practically? Well, it means when these things come up in conversation, spontaneously or planned, instead of saying, yeah, but, we say, tell me more. Tell me more about your experience as a person of color, or as a woman in the church, or as a millennial, or as a senior. Tell me more about that. And we just sit and listen. It means that in a meeting or a Bible study, we might choose to talk less or to talk last, so that people who might not feel as free to speak because of age or language or background might have a chance to speak first. It means that sometimes we sing songs in other languages or songs of other generations. So people who speak that language, people of that generation, will know that we value them, that we're enriched by the heritage they bring to our worship. It means that as a church, we're building relationships with churches across the city, churches of different cultures and denominations and sizes and styles. We're going out of our way to do that. Every week, Pastor Dana goes on the road to visit churches and pastors and leaders and communities and community leaders all over the city to build relationships. It means walking across the lobby to greet someone who's standing by themselves, or to join a group of people who are not exactly like us. It means being intentional about recruiting people of color, people of different abilities, people of all ages to join our teams or our groups or our staff. It means opening up our social calendars and our life communities and our friendship circles to people who are different than we are. And when we do those things, Jesus says, we'll discover that our lives and our church and our society are blessed in ways we could never imagine. Before we finish up, I'd like you to hear from someone who has experienced this kind of enrichment. As many of you know, recently, a couple of years ago, we launched some ministries to people of differing abilities in our congregation. Shine is for special needs children, and Stars is for cognitively challenged young adults. Our Shine ministry to children is being led right now by Elena Hogan. She's doing a great job. And what the Shine ministry does here and on all of our campuses is to pair an adult or maybe a young person with a special needs child, and they become a buddy to that child on a Sunday morning to kind of walk through the morning with them. My friend Bud Vasquez has been a Shine buddy for a year or so now, And when he told me what a great, enriching experience it had been, I said, you got to tell the church about that. So would you welcome Bud, Colonel Bud, as he comes and shares the story with us.
Invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Did you ever notice in that passage that it's not they will be blessed, it is that you will be blessed? By the world's standards, aren't we blessing them by giving them a dinner or inviting them to a party? Once again, God turns the world upside down. Many of you know my story starts with my wife, Molly, who has a huge heart for those with disabilities. Her story of turning cancer lemons into ministry lemonade is worthy of a sermon, but not today. Just so you know, I am no saint. When we started working with Shine and Stars a few years ago, I got involved for the not-so-altruistic goal of not driving 2 cars to church. Hey, it's tough enough to park 1 car, right? And I love my routines. And now I was being asked to interact with people who were different than me. But I was compelled for 2 reasons. First, Pastor Brian, you had spoken about making ourselves available to God and seeing where he leads. And secondly, I reflected on what Jesus himself did when he was on this earth. He spent a lot of time with people who were different with him, especially people with disabilities, the blind, the lame, the deaf, those with demons and leprosy, those with disabilities. Once God made me realize it is not us and them, that it's not ministering to people with disabilities, but it is ministering with people with disabilities. I found an amazing blessing, a glimpse into what I think the kingdom must be like. Watching volunteers like Elena and Tommy Hogan, Jay White, Bob Burns, Angela Ho, and many others give of themselves to help people in the members of the body of Christ who needed help. To see the heartfelt gratitude of parents who were able to worship, some for the first time in years, knowing their kids were safe and cared for, a gratitude that blossomed into a real community. And then probably most importantly, the unconditional love of young kids and young adults who by the world's standards are disabled. But I don't think they're disabled in God's eyes. I have learned that they often pray better and more fervently. They sing their hearts out. They praise God unashamedly. They don't complain. They're optimistic, God-centered, and a lot of times more fun than I am. They don't have angles on being nice to you. They just appreciate it. Kind of like God was tapping me on the shoulder saying, what about you? I have a dozen stories like that, watching kids who in the world will not experience many simple things we often take for granted. Watching these kids and their parents smile, relax, have fun, feel loved unconditionally and cared for, and to watch community grow was and is to me a glimpse of heaven on earth. I found joy and blessing when I stepped out of my swim lane, made myself available to God, turned it over to him to let him work. Not long ago, Elena and team were serving 2 families. They're now serving 22. But yet the work is not done. There's an additional 8 to 10 families seeing Grace as a welcoming place if we can only find a dozen or so more helpers. So let me sum this up with one revelation I think may speak to you. I got involved thinking I was going to help them. God used these kids and young adults to help me.
Amen. Thank you, Bud. So friends, I realize it's a challenging topic, and we're likely to feel uncomfortable with these things once in a while. But until we face that discomfort, we can never get to the places God would have us to be. So let's dare to enter into these conversations. Let's be bold enough to lay down our rights and privileges and preferences. Let's choose the lower place. Let's open our hearts and homes to each other and to people that the Lord may bring into our lives and our fellowship, because our culture desperately needs to see a better way of being human and of being in relationship with one another. And we, the church, have the motivation, we have the mandate from our Lord, we have the power of the Spirit, and we have the community of faith in which to live out these things. Please understand, I and we are not advocating any particular political movement or strategy. We're not endorsing any particular movement or party or candidate. We all make those decisions individually. We're simply declaring our intention to pursue this kind of community in our church, in our neighborhoods across the city and around the world, believing that Jesus wants everyone, people of every age and race and gender and class and ability to have a seat at his heavenly banquet table. And this morning, today, we have an opportunity to do just that, to gather as one people around his table in anticipation of the kingdom to come. So let's bow in prayer before we do that.